right. Good morning. I am Sharon Willis with Fairfax County Consumer Affairs. And prior to working with Fairfax County Consumer Affairs, I worked with the Department of Housing and Community Development, at which time I gained in-depth knowledge and skills regarding tenant and landlord issues. I am very excited to be here today to help you understand tenant and landlord issues. All right. Who here has ever rented an apartment or a house? Show of hands. Great. How about, have you ever purchased a home for rent? No? Okay. All right. Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into the terms and conditions in an apartment. For today, the overview that we're going to look at is parties involved in a lease agreement. We're going to talk about the property descriptions, lease terms and conditions. We're going to also delve into the financial aspects of the lease agreement, such as the rent payment, additional fees and security deposit, landlord and tenant responsibilities and obligations, and utilities. And at the end, we will wrap up with a recap of understanding your lease agreement. All right, so now that you understand what we're going to talk about, let's see what constitutes a lease agreement. A lease agreement is a legally binding contract between a tenant and a landlord. Sorry, I have to make sure I put my slides on. So a lease agreement actually is a legal binding contract between the tenant and the landlord. It includes the rules, the regulations, policies, and any provisions that the landlord decides to put in the lease agreement. So whether you're a first-time renter or an experienced renter, renting an apartment, a condo, a townhouse, or a single-family home can be very exciting. But one of the things that you need to understand is to know what is in your lease agreement. It covers the tenant that occupies the premises, and it's important to understand that a lease agreement is what constitutes your rights as a tenant. Now that you have understand what's in a lease agreement, let's look at the details that is crucial to both tenant and landlords. Properties involved. The landlord is the leaser, and the tenant is the leasee of the property. So when you first get your lease, it will indicate the name of the landlord and you, the leaser. It also, property description. The description of the property should include the physical address and any units in that lease. It also should identify if there's any parking, any amenities such as parking, also swimming pool, fitness center, or playgrounds. Some of the most common lease terms is the length of the lease agreement. The length of the lease agreement specifies that the lease is usually 1 year lease, which is 12 months. It has to have a commencement date, an expiration date, and also the date that you signed the actual lease agreement. It is also important for you to know what the policies are within the lease agreement. And you want to make sure that you pay special attention to if there's clauses in the lease agreement that considered, say, renewals or rent increases. Rent payment. The monthly rent for renting an apartment usually is 1 month's rent. It's actually, rent is due on the 1st of the month and late after the 5th of the month. Some landlords will give you an allowable grace period up until the 5th of the month. But just know that after the 5th, rent is late. And what you don't want to do is pay your rent late. So what most landlord does is they provide you with electronic payments. They use methods such as Rent Cafe, Rent Portal. They also use apps such as Venmo and PayPal for you to pay your rent. And paying your rent on these electronic portals will eliminate paying your rent late. Security deposits. Security deposits is the amount of money that a landlord collects for you to lease the unit and occupy the unit. Security deposit it varies by jurisdictions. In the state of Virginia, the landlord can only collect up to 2 months' rent in security deposit. The security deposit is used to protect the landlord from any damages or beyond normal wear and tear. Also, the security deposit can be used for unpaid rent, unpaid utilities, and unpaid pet fees. So again, the security deposit is to protect the landlord. It's also refundable. The landlords have up to 45 days to return the security deposit. And if, say for instance, there are damages to the property once the tenant moves out of the apartment, then the landlord must provide the tenant with an itemized list of charges and deductions, plus how much the return of the security deposit will be. So you want to make sure that the landlord, that when you return your property after you move out of the apartment, you want to make sure that you return the property in the same condition that you received the property in, so that you will receive your security deposit. Utilities. Utilities, all landlords require you to pay utilities, but it should be specified in the lease agreement. In the lease agreement, it will say the landlord will take care of probably the water and trash, but the tenant is responsible for paying for the electric and the gas. So you want to make sure that you look at your lease agreement and see exactly what utilities are acceptable. Also, the landlord wants to know who will set up the utilities at the beginning of the lease, or disconnection of the lease agreement. So the tenant, normally if you're responsible for the utilities, it's your responsibility to set up the utilities and to also disconnect the utilities at the end of the lease term. Additional rental fees. There are late fees, there are parking fees, rent check fees, and credit check fees, and rental application fees. However, if a tenant is responsible for paying these fees, the landlord must disclose of this information in the lease agreement. In accordance with the Virginia Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, the late fees for rent could be up to 10% of the amount, or 10% on the unpaid balance of the lease, whichever is less. Let's look at property rules and policies. Renting a room in Fairfax County, I have come to realize that there are lots of people that are renting rooms in Fairfax County and don't really understand what their rights are when it comes to renting a room. A lease agreement should specify rules, regulations when you're renting a room. If you're renting a room, you should not just think that it's okay to take I agree to rent the room without having a lease. You want to make sure that you have a lease and you know what your responsibilities are. Oftentimes, basement apartments cannot be rented. However, you must check with the Fairfax County Code Compliance Department before renting your basement. Renting a basement, if the tenant is in that basement and the landlord must provide 72 hours to do any kind of repairs in that particular unit, and also if, say for instance, there is an emergency, the landlord can enter that unit without providing you a notice. You also want to give the landlord access to the unit if there are any issues. Say, for instance, you call the landlord for repairs. A lot of times, residents may have other things going on and do not have the time to let the landlord in. So what you want to do is make sure that you set that time to have the landlord to come in and take care of any repairs that you need to get done. Understanding the rules and regulations and policies before signing a lease contract will help you to avoid any disputes or down the road. Tenants' responsibilities, rights, and obligations. A tenant is responsible to fulfill the duties of the lease agreement. And one of the things that a tenant first want to do is make sure that you pay your rent on time. You want to keep the leased property clean and sanitary. You want to also make sure that you can use the electrical, plumbing, air conditioning, and all the appliances in the unit in an undestructive manner. Comply with the building codes and for health and safety reasons. You should also promptly pay your utility bills. It is your responsibility as a tenant to clean and restore the property in its original condition upon move out. Tenants' rights, the landlord must also provide you with a copy of the statement of tenants' rights and responsibilities and a signed copy of your lease agreement. Responsibilities of the landlord. Now, the landlord is responsible for collecting the rent, for evicting a tenant for non-payment of rent or a lease violation, enters the unit in emergencies that threaten the property, enters the unit for scheduling of repairs, necessary repairs, maintain the unit in a habitable conditions, and return of the security deposit minus any costs or deductions to the tenant. One of the things that I would like to say is landlord must respect the privacy of all tenants. Disclosures. A landlord must disclose to prospective tenants and applicants if there are histories of bed bugs or lead-based paint and mold in the unit. A landlord also cannot force a renter to waive their rights to sue the landlord, refund security deposits, or discrimination. Any discrimination based upon race, sex, religion, disabilities, or sexual orientation, or other protective class are illegal under the Fair Housing Act. And landlord must adhere to the laws that provide fair and equal treatment to all tenants. Lease terminations. Before a landlord can terminate a tenant, the landlord needs to provide a written notice to vacate. A lot of times, the expiration of the lease, if you're in a one-year lease, the landlord will provide you with a 60 days notice that they are not going to renew your rent or the lease terms. For non-payment of rent, the landlord also is required to provide you with a notice for non-payment of rent. And they can also give you 5 days to pay that rent, or it states that you can also give you a 30 days notice to vacate. If you are unable to pay the rent during the period time, what happens here is that the landlord can start the eviction processing. Violation of the lease. Say, for instance, you have an unauthorized pet or an unauthorized tenant in the unit. The landlord can provide you with a 30 days notice so that you have that 30 days to either cure the unauthorized pet or the unauthorized tenant in that apartment. If you do not cure that unauthorized pet or unauthorized tenant, then the landlord has no other option but to provide you with a 30 days notice to vacate. Breach of the contract. If you breach a contract, again, the landlord will provide you with a notice to vacate if you cannot adhere to the rules and regulations of the contract. Lease terminations. Lease termination, the landlord can also provide you with the letter for you to terminate your lease. They will go through the eviction process. If you're in a lease, or say, for instance, you don't have a lease, the landlord cannot just put you out of the unit without providing you a notice to vacate and start a court proceeding. Also, a tenant can terminate their lease agreement for things such as the landlord fails to maintain the unit in a habitable condition, enters the unit without providing a 70 days notice, 72-hour notice, and if you are an active member of the military, victims of domestic violence, if the landlord mutually agrees to a lease agreement, to a lease termination, it can be done mutually and both parties can negotiate. If a fee is required, it's usually 1 month's rent plus a 30 days notice for you to vacate. Landlords are prohibited from evicting tenants in retaliation or discrimination reasons, and they may not unlawfully exclude you, the tenant, from the premises, interrupt any essential services, or make the unit unlivable. All right, so in closing, don't forget that understanding the lease agreement is very crucial. A lease agreement, you want to make sure you read through every section of the lease agreement. If you do not understand something about your lease, ask questions. Ask your landlord or ask the apartment community property manager, or you can call us. And you can also visit the Virginia State Residential Landlord and Tenant Act to get some insights as to how you can answer your own question. You want to make sure that the lease is signed and you receive a copy of the Statements of Rights and Responsibilities. And one last thing, never, ever agree to a verbal agreement. Thank you.